So my name is Yves Tiberghien. I come from Canada, in Vancouver. I am the director of the Institute of Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. I'm also the executive director of the UBC China Council, that is managing relations with China for the university. I'm also a professor in political science. I teach about global political economy, about global governance. I teach about Chinese politics, Japanese politics, Korean politics. I also teach about climate and environmental issues, in general, political economy. Well, I mean, there's a great irony about this, right? The TPP was developed by the Obama administration with the support of 11 other countries as a strategic initiative to draw new rules in the trading order and have, in a way, those 12 countries led by the US and Japan actively writing the next generation of trade rules. Since it couldn't be done in WTO, there is no success. And it was particularly targeted to make sure, in the competition against China, it was targeted at China. That is to make sure that while China is rising, is launching many initiatives, its own free trade agreements, its own Belt and Road Initiative, etc., that the US, Japan, and its allies would have a role drafting the new set of rules as well, right? And there was this competition among them. It was also aiming at rebalancing somewhat the trade in Asia toward the US, because the trend over the last 10, 15 years has been that trading flows and division of labor has been more and more centering around China. And so there has been a decrease in the percentage of trade of Asia with the US. So there was all those considerations. Those considerations remain true, right? In a sense, for most companies or most strategic thinkers in US or Japan, those factors remain correct. And in a way, it seems to be in the interest of the US. But what has happened meanwhile is because in the US, the division of gains from trade, not just TPP, but trade in general, have not been fairly distributed. That is, the majority of the American public is not benefiting from globalization. There's a concentration of wealth and benefits. Then as a result of that, the majority of voters has turned against trade. So the irony is why the TPP itself was a strategic tool for the US in a competition in a global level and was probably good for Japan and other countries that were part of it, including Canada. It became embroiled in that battle about the future of globalization and global capitalism. It became the battlefront, right? And that's why Trump promised to move out. In fact, Hillary Clinton had also committed not to ratify it. And the Congress was already indicated its refusal to ratify it. So it's not just Trump. There was a general movement, and that was due to the climate of politics within the US. But the problem with that model is that to address the rising inequality in the US, or to address the fact that the majority of the middle class, maybe 70% of the US people, have seen their living standards go down over the last 20 years, the solution is not less trade. The solution is better domestic public policy. You need better opportunities for public education, better public health care. You need, and tax redistribution in many ways. Those are domestic tools. Those are not trade. But because the Republican Party at the moment is ideologically against any redistribution and is trying to reduce taxes, in fact, have more and more tax cuts, they're undoing, over the last 20 years, they have been undoing the tools that would allow the distribution of the benefits of trade. And so there's a combination here between the anger of the public and the ideological positions taken by Republican majority in Congress, which makes it easier for them to turn away from TPP than to address the real problems. So there is something really ironic in a way in what is happening. That's why the other 11 countries want to move forward with a TPP 11 right now. They're discussing whether to do it. They might be open to add new countries like Korea, which is not part of TPP now. And in a sense, that way, they might create pressure on the US to come back. So the TPP may not be dead in the long term because that's a symptom of a larger problem. It's not the problem itself for the US, right? It got just caught up in this larger problem. Yes, so those are deep questions about deep trends. It is true that we find a number of countries where the public has turned away from support for free trade and globalization. First of all, the US, and the election of Donald Trump was dramatic. And the US is critical because the US created globalization. The US created the global order and created the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and all this. So to have the creator turn away against his own creation is a dramatic moment in history. Now, the cause is because the public doesn't fully understand what's happening. That is, the anger is really more domestic public policy than and the way trade has been mediated and managed. But the fact is they have turned away. In Europe, Brexit is complicated, but essentially the people that voted for Brexit are people that were also angry at the benefits from the economy and from globalization, felt that they were falling behind, and then they blamed the EU. But there was a similar stock of anger. It's less intense than in the US, with a thin margin in some ways. But there is that stock of people who feel they're falling behind. And we find a percentage of people who feel they're falling behind in most of Europe as well. In fact, in the French election, in the first round, 50% of voters voted together for extreme right or extreme left parties, all of which were opposed to globalization and EU. So there was a majority in the first round of presidential election in France against globalization and against the global liberal order. In the second round, because of the electoral system forces to converge on one candidate, then of course he got 66%, and there was, as a whole, a preservation of the support for the global order. But what's happening behind all this is, in a way, we are reaching a sort of peak in globalization. So far, the last 30 years have focused on expanding markets, expanding opportunities, creating growth and all this. But the leaders worldwide have not focused on sharing that growth and making it, creating opportunities. We find as a result that at least in Europe and US, but it's also present in Korea, it's present in Japan, we find a growing number of people that are falling behind. Often is rural area as opposed to urban. So the rural area, people are falling behind relatively. The younger people are falling behind relative to the older ones. And in some areas, large percentages. And so it's getting urgent to sustain the future of the global order and to keep the gains of common trade and common interaction. We need to address and support at the global level tools to help share, distribute better. But the problem is so many of those tools will be at the domestic level. So it's very hard to push from above. It's not like we can have the G20 ordering the US to raise taxes and help the poor people, right? And yet that's what you need, right? If you don't help them, they're gonna go against trade. The irony with the US is really at the center of that whole system, is that Donald Trump ran on a campaign to listen to those people falling behind. But his current policies, the budget policy, the healthcare policy, are actually hurting his own supporters. He's making things worse by actually cutting taxes and taking away budget from food aid, taking away support for public school, taking away healthcare for 23 million people. So it's actually incredibly ironic that he's, in a way, cheating on the people that voted for him, which will make things worse in the long term because they will get even more angry, right? Then there's the China factor. So China is an interesting player in all this because at one level, China was part of the reason why there has been such a distributional effect, because China is so big and has grown so fast and has been so quickly integrated into world trade that it has had a fast disruptive effect on the movement of labor, and particularly jobs that did not require high skills. So low-skilled jobs have moved away from developed countries to China and then now to other countries at a speed that was very fast. That speed also meant it was hard to adjust. At the same time, China has emerged, however, as a big supporter of the global order. So today, the great irony is you have the US, the creator of global capitalism, speaking against it, and China, the last big communist country, Leninist country remaining on earth, defending global capitalism and supporting it. So in any case, the effect from China is today relatively positive on the future of global order. But to conclude, the global liberal order is in the midst of a great battle, and its future is unknown. It's highly disputed now. There's great tensions. And to save it, it will require innovation in public policy and clever new ideas. So here is a simpler answer. The EU will get over it, but it's costly. It will not collapse. The bigger threat to the EU is the euro crisis. Britain was always a superficial and unwilling member of the EU. So when the EU process started with Jean Monnet in 1950, Jean Monnet was very friendly with the UK and wanted Britain in. He did, at the time he spent more than half of his time negotiating with the UK as opposed to Germany, Italy, and Belgium and all that. And in the end, Britain said no, so did not join the Steel and Coal Committee. In 1957, the UK did not want to join. And then in the 60s, early 60s, Europe started growing 5% a year and the UK 3% a year. So by the mid-60s, Britain was falling behind Germany, France, and all this, and was desperate to join. So they said, please let us in, please let us in. And at the time, General de Gaulle in France blocked the UK 3 times. And he said, I will never allow Britain to join because they will never believe in the European project. They will not be team players. They will only seek their own interest. As soon as de Gaulle died, then the veto fell, and in the early 70s, so finally it's in 73, 74, that the UK did join. But as soon as it joined, by the late 70s, it felt it was unfair and wanted to renegotiate, and so demanded budget back and better conditions. And Margaret Thatcher blocked the EU for 4 years in the early 80s. So that's just an example. Then, of course, Britain did not join the euro, did not join several other components. So in a sense, the UK was never a full-hearted member. And so it's okay. It was almost predictable that it would leave. The problem, however, is that it will take 3-4 years of very intense negotiations. And in the meantime, the European Union cannot be as active globally. So it's costly and painful as a divorce process, but it will not, cripple the EU completely. No. First, Russia is a different kind of country. I mean, Russia and China don't have much agreement, right? They don't have agreement on values. They have agreement on interests. So they have some common interests. When they are both pushed or threatened by the US, then they push back together. Or they have some common interest in oil or in particular economic interest. But actually, when you do an opinion poll in China of what are the top 5 concerns or worries of Chinese in the world, right? Number 1 is US. Number 2 is climate change. And number 3 is Russia, 3 or 4. Because in the past, Russia and China have had conflicts. So there's not a deep trust, right? Now, will China, and maybe with some like-minded friends in Asia, try to set new values? Not so far. That is, China is now developing many initiatives, many strategies, Belt and Road Initiative, the AIIB, it's launching free trade agreements, it's launching all kinds of new ideas, but so far those ideas are not changing the dominant values. They fit within a liberal frame. But if anything, they try to be a little less ideological about it, a bit more pragmatic, because the Chinese experience has been that you should follow 70% of global liberalism and 30% you should adjust and be different. So the way they did it is they opened trade, but they did not open full investment, and then they did not open finance. And then they go gradual. So they go gradual, they go sequential, they go experimental. So the Chinese way is gradual, sequential, pragmatic approach to globalism, but it's not anti-globalism. It's just adjusting to local circumstances. So it doesn't yet amount to a new set of values. So in a sense, the general values are still robust. Yes, populism. So there's different kind of populism. It's like a spectrum. At one level, populism is about new parties and party leaders that promise all kind of things in the name of listening to the public. So usually they're anti-establishment. They promise to act against the existing order, against the bureaucracy, against existing parties. Then there is leftist or rightist populism. In the case of rightist populism, they also have a target. So they target foreigners, immigrants, and the anger is directed toward them, whereas the leftist populists don't have that kind of foreign target. Instead, they target inequality and the rich class or the existing order. So at some level, there have always been populist governments in history, right? The US had the populist movement in the 1890s, 140 years, 30 years ago. But sometimes populism goes very far and becomes sort of radical and start to believe that the goals of opposing foreigners or the goal of destroying a dominant order, dominant elite, or dominant wealthy class justifies destroying some institutions. And we see some of that danger with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not just trying to change the trading order or change the way Washington runs. He's also criticizing the rule of law, is criticizing courts and judges, is criticizing the press. He says the press is an enemy, and this has created a climate where we had a congressman, a nearly elected congressman in Montana was elected the next day, beating up a journalist. So that starts to erode the pillars of democracy. Democracy requires a fierce protection of free press, free rule of law, and a whole bunch of conditions. When those get eroded, then it's in danger. So we are dancing at the limit right now. We have some populist movements and leaders, and especially Donald Trump, that go very far and cross the, in a way, cross the threshold. Now in the US, there's an intense pushback too, right? Journalists are pushing back, and the courts have turned down some of the orders that Donald Trump has advanced. Now Donald Trump will go to the Supreme Court. So there's an intense battle. It could be that in the end, the democratic institutions of the US will hold on, will be resilient. But it's a matter of how far it goes, how long it goes, and whether there is an ultimate crisis. Sometimes there could be another 9/11 or, God forbid, but another major crisis of terrorism, for example, which could give justification for the president to go further and really to start erode liberties and institutions. So populism is to be watched carefully. It is dangerous because it has fostered a sense of anger, a sense of breaking taboos, and if going further, it could usher some violence even. So regionalism goes through different phases, right? So there was a phase where, for example, in the EU, at the time when globalization was less intense, it became a way to reduce intense tensions and reduce the risk of war, but also prepare for economic integration at the global level. So it was an intermediary step toward globalization. And so in many ways, we have had regionalism as, gradually coming into play as an intermediate step. In some cases, regionalism also solves security problems by creating habits of meeting. In a way, ASEAN has started that way as a security community, then it turned into economy and other things. It can be a place of dialogue, etc. But today we are at a time of, crisis in globalization. There's a lot of tensions. There are some countries turning against it. And so suddenly regionalism could have a new role. That is, if the global order is in danger, then the second layer under, the regional layer, could be more resilient. And maybe it's easier to move forward at that level. We know already for trade that the WTO is not moving forward, and it's very hard to have any global agreement, but we can have regional agreements or bilateral agreements. So the same could be true in other spheres, where gradually regionalism becomes an intermediary stepping stone while the global level is in crisis. But it depends ultimately in the willingness of key countries to work together. So I think in the case of Asia, regionalism will be lively and innovative and will usher many solutions only in the end if Japan and China overcome their tensions and get to work more closely with each other. And it may be mediated by Korea. Korea has often played a key role as a place of dialogue. In fact, I'm impressed here at Jeju. I find very high quality dialogue between Japanese and Chinese because they are in a third country, in between, right? So there's something interesting here. And each region has its own realities and its own power dynamics. So Jeju Forum is quite a treasure. I attend a lot of global summits. I organize some myself. I organized a big Vision 20 summit this year in Washington to prepare the G20. But there's no other place like the Jeju Forum where there's a sense both of intense dialogue, very frank dialogue. You see people from different countries say things to each other here that they don't say elsewhere. So they're very frank, and yet there's also a sense of idealism here. There is a clear set of goals, peace, justice, prosperity, ecological progress. There's a set of clear goals, and it's a beautiful place, very blessed island. And I see that in a way, it nudges people to do something different and to find a new dialogue among each other. So it's quite a treasure for Korea, but actually for the whole region and for the world. Really enjoy being here.